Welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Cottmeyer. I'm here with my co-host, Jeffrey Gray. Today, our guest is John Flavin, the founder and CEO of Portal Innovations. Portal is a life sciences venture capital firm that excels in bringing crafted capital to top life sciences innovators and emerging biotech ecosystems to offer them a clear path to success through their company's early stages. With this approach, John and his team are experts in creating ecosystems of innovation in the biotech and medtech spaces. We're excited to share this expertise with you, the listener, today. John, it's great to have you. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's an honor.
Thanks for joining us. I see is that a background or are you actually in Chicago, my hometown?
No, it's the real deal. Yeah.
All right. Love it.
Behind us, you can see the Willis Tower, and it's a kind of a gray, overcast day here in the city.
Love it. Love the Windy City.
If any of you out there are into good views, head over to one of the Portal offices. They got the nicest spaces and the best views in any city I've been in. So head over there and check them out.
Yeah, our mantra is scientists are people too, so you get the cool views.
And scientists are always so used to just dull, gray basement spaces. So I think it's a good change of pace.
Agreed.
So, John, you have an education background in finance, but you've spent just about your whole career in the life sciences research space. Can you tell us if there was a personal experience or a motivated factor which inspired you to get involved into life sciences innovation? And what has continued to push you to innovate in this space for the last, I think it's been over 30 years, right? What's kept you inspired over your career?
I got excited about the field mainly kind of dating back, I would say, to high school. I had to write a paper for a science class and somehow picked up the subject of how aspirin works and how it is a so-called prostaglandin inhibitor. I love
Mhm.
like scientific terms and words. That's something that's carried forward over my entire career, I must say, as I think back on it. I did that because I was inspired by my older brother Mike, who's 12 years older than me, and he was finishing up his PhD in medicinal chemistry, the study of molecules that can inhibit prostaglandin to decrease pain or to have other effects on the human body, a so-called drug or therapeutic. So I was always really fascinated and inspired by science. When I went to go and pursue my degree at Marquette, where I went to college, I was also very excited about and was always trying to follow in the footsteps of my dad, who was a really strong mentor to me over my lifespan. He spent his career at Inland Steel, 38 years there, but was always working in computers and systems, dating back to when it was the IBM mainframe. But early on, as a young kid and growing up through high school, got to take several trips out to the Bay Area with him, all at the time when Silicon Valley was coming into its own and learning the stories of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and others, Fairchild Semiconductor. That whole field of entrepreneurship really grabbed me. And my dad, although he worked at a large company, was very entrepreneurial in the risks he took with his career and going after this nascent field of computer technology back in the day. I think it was those two kind of people and their stories that got me going in the journey around life sciences. So when I graduated from Marquette, I had a background in finance. And at the time, Mike had finished his postdoc at Harvard in chemistry. He had worked a couple years at Baxter here in Chicago and wanted to first start a company to develop a drug. I felt like I knew a lot about finance, and he felt like he knew a ton about developing a drug. And we got engaged in our first venture, MediChem Life Sciences. And MediChem started in a 400 square foot lab on the campus of University of Illinois at Chicago in an incubator. And we started on a small business innovation research grant, $50,000 to get the company off the ground. And so my whole role was really getting enough knowledge about the science to be able to tell that story to people with money that were willing to invest in the ideas. In the beginning, it was a bank getting a loan and buying some computers and some glassware for the laboratories. But over time, it became raising money through venture capital firms and ultimately doing a few IPOs. I'm always working at the interface between the science and back to the people. In this case, it's working with people like Mike that I'm inspired by to be able to bring those ideas to life. And really, that was kind of the seed crystal that blossomed over time into what I'm working on in the present day, which happens to be same type of people, same type of, challenges and opportunities, but just in a different playing field.
Yeah, it's amazing that you're exposed to that level of collaboration in the life sciences space early on, because many people kind of stay in a silo early on in their careers and they don't necessarily gain an appreciation for what it takes to, bring a medical product to life or a life sciences product to life. And just like you said, right, it brings you quite easily to where you are, today, decades later. Can you tell us a bit about what you're doing today and what y'all do at Portal Innovations?
And before you start that, let me just one thing leading into this, your answer, I wanted to share. You've got some real cachet around Portal. I was at an event of yours in Atlanta, and there was a couple of selfies, and probably had 50 people. So in 2 or 3 days, text me, email me, or in person. They're like, "What's Portal? What are they doing?" Right? And so in bio and life sciences, you're well known, but in a lot of our ecosystem, they don't really know what Portal Innovations is. What's your mission and vision? So as you answer Daniel's question, help our listeners and viewers that don't know what you do understand what you're all about.
Yeah, well, continuing around my own personal story in building MediChem and our first company, ultimately, we raised venture capital money, we built a building, we did an IPO, and we got acquired. And that was over a 10-year time horizon. And every step of that journey was a learning process. It was a constant new set of experiences to go through to ultimately bring that company through that arc of development. And through those experiences, that motivated us to go on and do the second company and do another IPO and apply those same techniques and capabilities to a new application in our second company. Through those experiences, we were building those companies in Chicago, which historically has not been known as a place where a biotech ecosystem existed. And so, one motivation for me coming out of our second company and that second IPO was trying to explore a way to move the needle in Chicago to build more of a repeatable and sustainable ecosystem that you can find in other places, especially in Boston and in the Bay Area. And the raw ingredients have always been present in Chicago. Great institutions, University of Chicago, Northwestern, Loyola, University of Illinois, Rush Medical Center, two national labs, Argonne and Fermi, and then large pharma presence and a great global city. I mean, the Windy City is a great place to live, work, and play, but it never really had the startup ecosystem in place. What changed about a decade ago was the movement by universities to modify their business model in light of the deterioration of government funding for basic and applied research. And been a movement underway, almost an innovation arms race. And we certainly saw it here at the University of Chicago, where I was engaged in helping the university create a destination for entrepreneurship and innovation, working from within the university to create the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. That was all designed to attract and retain a new type of innovator to the ecosystem. University of Chicago has a storied past of great breakthroughs across a whole range of different fields, several Nobel laureates ranging from physics to chemistry and biology and even economics. But it was a real conscious effort to move beyond theory and into applications by moving into engineering and commercialization when we conceived and built the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. And that attracted a new type of faculty member into the ecosystem that was not only interested in publishing their work in science and cell and nature, they wanted to go a step beyond and create impact. And the impact was, I want to take my idea and turn it into a company that can help a patient in the biomedical arena. And so that really was a shaping of the concept around the formation of Portal Innovations. Portal Innovations is the culmination of my experience as an entrepreneur and my observations of what's going on even globally, not just nationally, as large research institutions are adapting their business model to become more focused on translation, going from an idea into a patent, into a company, into a company that makes it through FDA approval and delivers a novel innovation to a patient. And that's a complex and long, expensive journey. So Portal was designed to really help university spinouts take the next step and do that locally, do that in a place where they wanted to continue their development. So the Portal platform is combining laboratory space with seed stage capital and then human experienced talent to be able to help entrepreneurs go from pre-seed all the way into Series A. And when you look at Chicago, we didn't have the infrastructure. So we formed Portal to raise a fund, and to use that fund in Chicago, we needed a laboratory. So there's two beautiful buildings here known as Fulton Labs. Portal Innovations has 3 floors in the building. And so that's what Portal does. And so we decided that with success here in Chicago, we wanted to expand the model to other places that we felt had similar potential, but didn't have the infrastructure, didn't have the seed stage capital, and didn't have the know-how, pattern recognition of spinning out a company, building it up, decreasing the risk, and then raising institutional capital at the Series A level. And so that's what we're doing now in Atlanta, in Houston, in Boston, soon in Providence, Rhode Island, in New Jersey, and even in Dublin, Ireland. And the concept is, by building this global network of these physical hubs, we at Portal have an opportunity to be the first investor in these new emerging markets where we think the innovation is untapped and is on par with, if not even better, and certainly different than what you'd find in more mature ecosystems like Boston and the Bay Area. So that's who Portal is. We're all about, essentially, going back to my early story, it's about creating a more definable path for me as a young entrepreneur and my brother Mike that really had to figure all this stuff out, building a lab, raising money, finding others that we could talk to about, mistakes made and how we would overcome them. What lawyers should we talk to? And so Portal brings all of that together for entrepreneurs right as they step out of the university and get their venture started.
Yeah, that's amazing. There's a lot to take in there. You talked a lot about, or alluded to, a lot of the difficulties that it takes to go from an idea, right, in the life sciences and med tech space to an actual commercial product. And I think a lot of people in our age tech community, we don't work as much in the biosciences or life sciences space, but you can see how there's a massive overlap between the two, right? It's aging is a risk factor for nearly every single disease. Any sort of life sciences company that addresses disease also has an overlap with age tech. So with that, can you dig a little bit more into exactly what are the unique challenges that are faced by biotech companies trying to get in through that early stage? And specifically, how does Portal, not only as a single hub, but having that expansive network across the United States, how does that address those unique needs of biotech companies?
Well, a entrepreneur that's trying to bring, a new molecule to the marketplace to become a drug begins that journey often through discovery at the bench of a university researcher. The next step is if the product is deemed to be useful in early assays in a petri dish. So let's say they're going after, trying to treat a cancer patient. The first step would be testing that molecule in a petri dish to see whether it has activity and a potency profile that is worthy to first file a patent and protect that innovation. And then beyond that, is this molecule potency and features different than other cancer agents that are already on the market? And the next steps then, if the conviction is high and strong, is to move that molecule into a company. And the first step that a company formation happens in this fashion would be to license the patents from the university into the company. That becomes then an asset to the company. And then the molecule is beginning a long journey through the preclinical development phase. Preclinical development means you got to start moving beyond petri dishes, and you have to test it in mouse models and rat models to demonstrate that in these models of where these rats and mice have cancer, that indeed you're seeing that molecule continue to show the potency at the appropriate dose to keep moving it forward with increased expense as you're trying to approach ultimately getting through animal studies. Usually the FDA would require beyond mice and rats, demonstrating safety and efficacy in a larger species, sometimes a pig or a dog or a sheep model. And then what happens next is if you can demonstrate safety and efficacy, you meet with the FDA and you file what's called an investigational new drug application, an IND. And that's a full dossier that can demonstrate to the FDA that you are making an argument that you have an agent that's safe enough to bring into humans. And so phase one, if you're given permission to move forward, is all about demonstrating safety of the molecule and trying to establish the dose. And then phase two is all about in the patient population, establishing not only the dose, but showing that you have efficacy in the human population. So, this is where a lot of drugs fail. It works in mice, works in rats, but the translatability into the human, oftentimes there's fall off. But if it continues to move forward, then it moves into phase three, and that's all about a larger study to confirm the safety and efficacy. And on the heels of that, the company files a new drug application with the FDA to seek permission that includes the full human and preclinical development dossier to get that drug into the market. Now, you can imagine that's an expensive endeavor. There's a lot of years involved in that process. And again, many of these molecules fall off in preclinical development or in phase one or in phase two. So the failure rate can be high. So what we have to focus on is the front end of the pipeline. We are very focused on helping the entrepreneur at the front end of the journey understand what they need to do in the next 18 to 24 months to de-risk their technology, get through preclinical development, file the IND with the FDA, raise a Series A with a defined clinical study, getting advice on what that study should look like, the right protocol, the right type of patient. There's a lot of details that you don't know when you're getting started in this endeavor. So although the entrepreneur at the front end of this relay race likely won't be the one that's finishing the race, because at the end of this process, oftentimes there's either a new CEO or there's a pharma company that buys the company, after FDA approval or just prior. But the founding team still needs to know what's going to happen at the back end. Because if you're working on something that is the same as what's already out there, or it's incrementally better, you're not going to find investors. You won't find partners. All these things can be learned by bringing in the community, mentors, investors, the marketplace at the very front end of the process. So when you think about Portal, we deliver all of that to the entrepreneur upfront in the process so that they are prepared to make the right decisions to increase the chances that that molecule is going to keep moving down that pathway.
Yeah, they say about raising a kid. I don't have any kids, but it says it takes a village, is what I've heard, right? And it sounds like it's the same sort of concept when we're talking about taking a molecule, right, into maturity. And you talked about having to bring all these components in to guide people through this process. And I believe you at Portal have used the term crafted capital to describe what are the resources that you need to bring in. Can you describe to us and our listeners the concept of crafted capital and how that helps early stage entrepreneurs in this industry?
Yeah, crafted capital really embodies three currencies. One is obvious, it's cash, financial resource in the form of pre-seed or seed funding in through Series A. The second is fully equipped laboratory space, and the third is human capital. Now, in a fully developed ecosystem like Boston, you can find all of these in different parts of a fully developed ecosystem. You can go find a lab, you can go raise money, and you're going to find human capital in a more mature ecosystem. But when I was starting Portal, if I had just raised a fund to invest cash capital into ventures in Chicago and helping them get started, we would not have been able to deliver on the mission because there was no laboratory space to be able to house those companies. So combining capital with a laboratory space becomes critical. And thirdly, it's not just about a lab and money. It's who you're partnering with, the knowledge you need, whether it's on the team or from an advisory perspective or from a partnering or investor perspective. The crafted capital is delivering all three of those pieces of the recipe all at the same time at the front end of the process. And if you're not doing that in an emerging ecosystem, you then may have empty buildings because no one knows what to do with those buildings. You may have money, but the money is all going to other places because it's not something that you're doing here. Now, you can do great science in a university, and historically at University of Chicago or Northwestern, these prolific innovation houses over time have spun out great intellectual property and talent, but it's been exported, to other more robust ecosystems. So to create a sustainable ecosystem locally, that crafted capital is a key part of the recipe as you're baking an ecosystem. And if you don't have all three at the same time, you will find it difficult to really get to scale. And so that's really what we deliver day in and day out to a whole portfolio of companies. Now we've grown our network, as we've mentioned, across the country and even internationally. We now are supporting 110 companies across these ecosystems. And by having these hubs in emerging ecosystems, the talent pool, the capital base, and the key opinion leaders that exist can all be brought to bear in each local ecosystem. So I can find great capital in Boston by being a Chicago-based portal company or an Atlanta-based portal company because we're part of Boston and we have friends there. We have friends with money that want to invest in companies that are not only in Boston, but they're seeing great potential in these other ecosystems and leveraging our track record and our brand at Portal. We're finding more and more co-investors that want to invest in these new locations because we, are on the ground and we're identifying these new opportunities. So ironically, having the global network is increasing the local value in each of these ecosystems because of the connectivity across a broader platform. In biotech, you can't work in isolation. It truly does take a village. Again, and the village it's got to be a big village and it spans the globe. It takes so much capital, knowledge, people, partners that, you can't be bound by any one location or person for that matter.
John, can you tell us about, how you find these entrepreneurs and the process by which they become a Portal Innovations portfolio company? How do you find them? How do you vet them?
Well, we partner closely with universities, where we know that early investments through grant funding is creating novel intellectual property and the individuals behind those innovations that are creating the novel intellectual property. So it's relationships, it's proximity, it's the convening power that we have by offering our partnering capacity. I mean, when you think about the continuum, we're a good friend and partner to the universities that are around us because those universities also have a goal to translate and they want to see great ideas, get to patients and they'd love to see it happen locally if they can. So partnering with universities is first and foremost how we identify good opportunities. But we aid our initiative by leveraging a tool that we invented and have been applying for the past couple of years called Stargaze. It's an AI tool which allows us to identify rising star faculty that are working in areas of research that we think have high potential for impact for patients downstream and therefore could be very investable by our syndicate of investors, including ourselves, and could be very attractive to pharmaceutical partners that we know ultimately will help these ideas get to the marketplace, as I explained before. So using the Stargaze tool, in addition to the relationships that we have, we're able to identify areas of research that we think are getting funded. The funders behind it are part of our database, not only venture capital firms, but also up and coming funds. Again, as you see NIH pull back its funding, Private
Mhm.
sources of funding need to start to step in. And so family offices that are increasingly interested in investing in biotech and life sciences, new foundations or single research organizations that are going after one disease area, story-led ventures, that were motivated by a rare disease that affected someone in their family. They've started a patient advocacy group, they've raised money, and they're going after the investment into that specific field of research. You have large institutes that are rising now here in Chicago. We're fortunate to partner closely with the Chan Zuckerberg Biohub.
Mhm.
$200
Yeah.
million investment over 10 years into biosensors and inflammation and immunology. So Stargaze mines all of that data and matches for us from a diligence perspective, helps us enrich our knowledge as to who's the right researcher to make the investment in at the right time with the right field of technology that are likely going to find the right capital partners so that ultimately we're investing in things that have a high degree of possible success downstream. And then having our human interaction and relationships in addition to that tool, it increases our ability to knock on the door of that researcher, oftentimes even before a technology transfer office might be aware that, this individual and this area of research could be transformative.
I was gonna ask you that. So using Stargaze, you may be the one doing the outreach, right? And saying, "You've come up on our radar and we'd like to talk to you."
Yes, and it's a little bit of both. We certainly get inbound.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just the institution, but it's the faculty. And what you find over time, great ecosystems are often built by prolific individuals. A few individual researchers, when you think about the Boston story, Phil Sharp and Bob Langer and others have led to Alnylam and Biogen, and the industry has been created repeatedly, by these repeater academic entrepreneurs that are creating multiple companies. And so it's being in a place where you're able to establish a good relationship with those repeater entrepreneurs, that are starting not just one company, but multiple companies. And so that's kind of how we both identify, but then also either repeat or build relationships with the institutions behind those individuals.
Yeah.
Perfect. And so you talk about a lot about needing some initial when trying to create an ecosystem of innovation, right? There needs to be some sort of initial capital in that ecosystem. There needs to be some sort of existing field of entrepreneurship, right? Some rising stars in that ecosystem. But we have a lot of individuals in our community at AgeTech Connect who are looking to start AgeTech ecosystems where they're at. If you're kind of like a grassroots individual, if you were to speak to these grassroots individual trying to build up an ecosystem, how do you recommend they start approaching the movers and the shakers in their community to really build up a robust ecosystem of innovation?
Well, what we've found in creating the portal playbook is there's a lot to be said about convening power and placemaking. So in our crafted capital model, we have used the full value of our convening power to connect dots. Building a portal in the present day is really the culmination, as I mentioned earlier on, of many years of the evolution of the Chicago landscape. And Portal was more possible today than it was a decade ago, and a lot of that was because of the changing of the talent coming into the ecosystem, as I mentioned earlier, with new faculty coming in that wanted to start companies around their idea. And they were indeed investable, not only in Chicago, but in Boston and in the Bay Area. The arrival of those individuals were new dots that weren't here before. But what I have found to be the most profound element of creating an ecosystem is recognizing that before you can start to invest in the companies, you do have to invest in the platform that is the ecosystem. And you'll find in many of these communities, the dots are there, but historically, they simply have not been connected. That certainly was the case in Chicago. And sometimes it takes external forces to create crisis that cause these dots to need to connect more frequently. And I would say that in Chicago and likely in these other, ecosystems, I think it We've certainly seen it in the other places where we're building our portal enterprises in these emerging ecosystems. In many ways, the credit crisis coming out of 2008 was a huge change in the culture in Chicago to become more accepting of the word entrepreneurship and the corporate promise. Over 100 years, Chicago was kind of a corporate town. You built your career. I mentioned my dad earlier. I mean, he spent 38 years at the same company climbing a ladder. That was what you did. And when the credit crisis rolled through Chicago and other communities, that promise was broken. And that changed the culture, the mindset of our next generation of future entrepreneurs. So there's now a movement created that says, hey, I want to be my own brand. I may want to start a company tomorrow, but the number one concentration at Booth at the University of Chicago is entrepreneurship. Same at Northwestern. And that's a sea change from where it was 10 to 15 years ago. So you have to be aware of what are the macro environments that are causing this crisis. How do you take advantage of that crisis? How do you find the individuals that you can use your own brand or physical location to bring this community together? Now, before Portal started, I launched with a couple other peers and my brother, Pat, a platform called Matter in the Merchandise Mart 10 years
Yep.
ago. And that platform didn't exist before, but we knew we had all these pieces. The community, really didn't have a place to go. I used to say, we've got this mentoring network now. We've got faculty that are arriving that want to start a company around their ideas. We formed this informal group of mentors that got together once a month. We would meet in the UBS building once a month and hear from three entrepreneurs, one from UIC, one from Northwestern, and one from the University of Chicago. And that became a repeatable thing. And it got so much momentum that we finally said, hey, we've got this community that's building, and we've got a congregation, if you will, but we had no place to practice. So we convinced Mayor Emanuel at the time and the current governor, J.B. Pritzker, to help us launch Matter. And Matter then became the centerpiece that connected the dots and really was the first pillar in this ecosystem that is still doing its role today, that in many ways Portal was able to build around that and on top of an incremental to what had been built, a decade earlier. So convening power, sometimes it's just your name and a coffee shop and a big enough group to get a snowball effect going. Then maybe it's a conference room, at a hotel in town. And then maybe it's enough to say, we need a place. And then when that place gets going, you've got critical mass. And when the critical mass gets going, you can start to do things on top of that you always felt were possible, but were only made possible because of this growing critical mass of investors, pharma companies, entrepreneurs, scientists that are now getting together, not just by force, but casually, socially. And so when you look at the Portal town halls in any place where we operate, it's a wonderful place. It really is a town hall. It's people coming together that needed to be together, but they weren't connected before. And because there was no place to do it, there just wasn't a reason to get together. So my advice to a rebel force of AgeTech ecosystem builders would be, start with the people that are excited as you are, get them together, and then start to move the needle and recognize that in some respects it does take time, but you don't need to be at full scale on day one. You need to scale towards that. And macro forces are driving more talent into these ecosystems that weren't there before. Back to my story. If the arrival of these translational faculty did not occur, we would have great buildings. We'd have a lot of people that want to get together and drink a beer and kombucha. But if those innovators aren't here, that's a missing piece. So you got to make sure you're cultivating the source of innovation, in any ecosystem that you're building.
Yeah, I love that you
Un-
bring that up because I feel like it's an undervalued aspect of a lot of communities is just the casual getting together of it all, right? dare I say, I don't want to say unpurposeful meetings, right? But just kind of saying, hey, let's get everybody in a room and see what comes out of it, right? That's been very successful, for our expansion with AgeTech Connect. You started to say something, Jeff, so I want to let you finish your.
By the way, on the convening power, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I've had so many people over the years ask me what we are interested in doing besides bringing people together, which I think is kind of funny. We're doing that first, that's the sauce. Curious, tell me a little about Boston. You mentioned that kind of the formula, the playbook that you've written is to, bring the Portal playbook into less mature markets. Was there some magic to Boston, which is obviously in a highly evolved market? Did you feel, okay, we're generally going to run this playbook, but there's something magical about Boston where we need to be there? I mean, what brought you to Boston particularly?
It's really this global strategy connecting to ecosystems. So great ecosystems, and it's kind of funny. A lot of times, the early thinking around ecosystems, especially, with an economic development mindset, there was always kind of misplaced ideas around building an ecosystem as a zero-sum game. Like, we're better than that place, or there's no reason why we shouldn't be as good as this other place. And we're going to bring people in from there to come here. And it's the opposite of that. Ecosystem building is about partnering. And just like you're partnering between people or different disciplines or different scientists or different VC groups in a syndicate, ecosystems need to collaborate as well. So as we were conceiving, our global network, we were not trying to exclude Boston. We wanted to connect ourselves to the global biotech grid, having a spot in the neighborhood with all of our good friends there. I mean, look, I've raised a ton of money from and I've partnered with many people in Boston. It's a storied place for good reason and will continue to be. And it took time for it to develop, as we know. But being present there and what it offers as a distinct piece of the global hub that we're building confers value across our whole landscape. Now, in Boston, we chose to be in an emerging submarket of that ecosystem. So we're not in Kendall Square. We're not, in the corridor. We are in South Boston, in Dorchester. We're near UMass Boston. Think a great talent pool, in Quincy and Brookline and all around that area. But we're in the old Boston Globe building, beautiful, iconic building that's been reinvented. This 720,000 square foot building is now reinvented into floors of laboratories. And the idea there for us was to say that's the right place in the neighborhood for Boston because Dorchester has not benefited from the biotech boom that has happened around the corner in Fenway and in Chinatown and what's happening up around Tufts. But there's no reason why we can't use our model, crafted capital, to be able to help entrepreneurs that maybe don't have the access to those other ecosystems, but they now do by being in Dorchester. So we're serving a local market need, which is the portal essence and the crafted capital and who we are in a new place in Boston, and we're building it up. But strategically, we are in Boston and we are connected, and all of our ecosystems are connected. We do tons of events where our companies that we've invested in Atlanta are continually meeting with investors that we're curating in Boston, and same thing with Houston.
Yep.
But it's interesting. We've got now, because we're in Boston, we have more people that want to co-invest with us. So it's building this global following of investors that are seeing our credibility in every ecosystem that we're operating within. And now we're seeing investors, family offices in Chicago investing in Atlanta companies, in Boston companies, in Houston companies. And we're seeing some of that start to transfer. Houston
Right.
family offices investing in Atlanta and in Chicago. Like, that's capital that was not circulating to these ecosystems before. So that's the strategy around Boston, and it's gone quite well. It is a special place, and we're using it both for our ability to build and derive value locally, but also strategically across the globe.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I keep thinking to myself, the name Portal for your company is just incredibly prescient. I don't know if having resources hop from one place to another instantaneously, if that was your broad view and you named the company. But it is incredibly fitting with the way that Portal operates to transport all those elements of crafted capital that you talk about really across all the hubs and communities that you create.
Yeah, no, I owe that to my wife, Judy, was the one that came up with that concept.
Mhm.
I've run with it, and there's just so many reasons why it's perfect. The essence of a portal is that as you enter, you get transformed as you exit. And that happens on both sides of the portal. It's not just translating from the university into a company, and into venture capital and down to the patient. You got to bring all those other stakeholders, big pharma and the venture capital firms. They have to enter the portal too, and they have to learn and translate. So I love that, cosmic feature. And especially when you think about the convergence and quantum and, it's perfect for what we do. And I think it really truly represents the essence of what we think is needed ultimately to keep innovation in prime form and elevate innovation in places that maybe didn't have the opportunity to get to scale, but by being there physically and with our crafted capital over the course of the next couple of decades, the stories will change for the benefit of patients.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I went to your Atlanta grand opening event and all the graphics and the portal, everything. I was like, man, this is slick. This looks nice. Moving on a little bit from that, we've talked a lot about bringing all these people into one place, right? The importance of having all the expertise together and connected by a network. But I've found on like a person to person level, it can sometimes be difficult to get experts from these different fields. So being finance, academia, entrepreneurs, for to get all these people from these kind of originally disparate fields to interact in a really effective way. For instance, to a lifelong academic, pursuing capital or developing a go-to-market strategy can seem very intimidating. So, what advice would you give to those who are looking to expand their impact and dip into these other silos of innovation, right? Or even to people who are aiming to connect these disparate fields into one cohesive unit?
Well, I think first and foremost would be to try to understand, is there a place where that community gathers? And is it local or is it somewhere else? And how do you begin to get connected? Networking is at the core of building value, for your own personal career. And that is true as you become part of a company and the company becomes part of an ecosystem as it moves to build value for shareholders over time. And in order to really be successful in building a network, you have to accept that it's all about being bold and trying to understand how to put yourself in situations where you're being exposed to different points of view, different individuals that have different skills. Trying to understand going into the endeavor, if you're about to start a company around your idea and you feel like there's areas that you may have certain expertise in, but you lack in others. Identify the type of person or skill that you're looking for and start to figure out, who in the community meets that profile. And what you find is that reaching out and asking the question and asking for help and support. I don't know if you've found this, but I've found it repeatedly. People want to help, but I think like any real opportunity, it's not going to just fall in your lap. The network won't just drop in on you. You have to go and pursue it. And when there's not one formed yet, then it's more difficult. And again, I would say that has been my experience prior to Portal, prior to Matter. We didn't have these networks built for us, so we had to come up with our own and find the closest thing to knowledge. In my case, in building our early mentoring network, it was my family. I mean, it was my dad. I mentioned, he had some friends that knew some lawyers, and it was Mike. He knew some chemists, and some of his colleagues went to Merck and worked at Abbott. And so, what's your seed crystal? What's your beginning substrate that you can start with? And it turns out you probably know more people and you're more connected than you think you are to begin with. Where'd you graduate from? Mine that network. Who's on the board of trustees? And I bet a lot of them are local, and you may have more in common with those individuals than you thought. You probably share the same alma mater, and that might be enough to have a conversation with someone that you may otherwise have felt intimidated to approach. And Jeff, you know this, creating these platforms is all about reducing the anxiety factor and making it easier to engage on a more social level. But before that happens, and even after that happens, you really got to work on cultivating your network and don't be intimidated and realize that you're probably more connected than you think you are. Work on it.
Yeah, when we're looking at, mission-based communities like AgeTech, right, or even the life sciences, when you guys share that common mission of wanting to innovate, right, and make the aging experience better, it's so much easier for an academic to talk to an entrepreneur because you share that same thread and that same overall goal. And just because we're running up towards the edge of time, I want to ask you one last question. You're exposed to so many great innovations in your line of work. What trends are you seeing that you believe could have the greatest impact on our aging population and for our age tech innovators?
Well, I think we're living at a very exciting time for science. And I think biology is transforming before our eyes. You think about some of the recent advances with Jennifer Doudna's work around CRISPR, how that's led to, the cure of sickle cell. Recently, with baby KJ for gene editing, it cured a rare disease. More of that's coming. CRISPR applied research,
Yep.
and how it is delivered, through cell therapy and those kinds of things. So remain very excited about how that field will continue to become really transformative for health, more on the curative side of treatment, which could then certainly lead to longevity and aging better. But what I really like to look at is, how a lot of these ideas and concepts are leveraging not just that biological tool, but how it's being combined with a physics-based approach. So using a device to deliver, a cell therapy, and how you might be using, a 3D printed fibers to deliver the cell therapy, to a patient that's undergoing fibrosis. So it's the combination of computing, physics and materials, and biology that I think are going to drive some amazing both preventative and curative treatments for patients. I spend a lot of time really looking at, one area that we know there's a big unmet need, and I feel like we're on the verge of breakthrough from a therapeutic indication perspective is in neurodegenerative diseases. I think
Yes.
the area of the brain and these tools, physics, computing, AI, and biology, I think are particularly applicable to the breakthroughs that I think can happen around diseases of the brain, whether it's, epilepsy or Parkinson's, Huntington's disease. I'm really hopeful that we'll see transformative impact through companies we're investing in today in the next decade.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of exciting innovations coming down the pipeline that's going to make aging in 20 years much different than aging is today. And I appreciate people like you and Portal for helping push those innovations along. With that said, I know I've learned a lot today. I really appreciated having you on. I'm sure Jeff would say the same. Can you
Yeah.
tell us and the listeners about how to get connected with Portal and how to learn more about what y'all are doing?
Yeah, you can check out our website, portalinnovations.com. On there, you'll find tabs for Stargaze. If you want to be part of the Stargaze network, it's easy to join that. We do a monthly newsletter. So all the stuff that we're doing across the globe, we describe. We're all about, yes, we're trying to include, we're trying to connect, we're trying to provide access where it wasn't being provided before. So we'd love to give you the warm Portal hug, whether it's virtually or in person at any of our locations. But the best front door to the portal would be the website.
Of course.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, John, for joining us and for all especially sharing some great advice for our community leaders and also for innovators. Really appreciate it.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me on.